Imagine being, well, functionally numb for a decade. Like
Yeah.
you are trapped inside this walled garden of your own grief, just keeping the entire world at arm's length.
Right, yeah, completely isolated.
Exactly. And then you wake up on a random Tuesday feeling inexplicably, overwhelmingly blissful. Like, what actually causes a human brain to spontaneously break its own trauma loop?
It's actually one of the most profound psychological shifts a person can experience. I mean, it feels spontaneous, right? But it is usually the result of this microscopic, almost invisible internal tipping point.
Wow. Yeah.
It's this moment where the sheer exhaustion of holding up those defensive walls just, well, it finally outweighs the fear of what actually lies beyond them.
That is the exact tipping point we're unpacking today. Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. We are digging into Book 1, Chapter 15 of Professor Cromwell-Smith's story, and really focusing on this profound roadmap for emotional recovery.
It really is a roadmap, yeah.
It is. We are looking at how someone transitions from being a passive spectator of their own grief to, well, becoming an active participant in life. And the text gives us this jarring, striking image of the professor on this specific morning.
Yeah, the morning everything changes.
Right. Because for years, he has been locked in this intense internal battle with the darker voice of his shadow self. He has allowed this voice to keep him, like, frozen in time because of a lost, irreplaceable true love.
And he built that walled garden as a sanctuary, right? But it really became a prison because the shadow self is essentially the ego's defense mechanism.
Oh, absolutely.
It just whispers that isolation is the only way to prevent further pain. But on this particular morning, the professor feels those familiar internal quibbles creeping up, that shadow trying to pull him back down into the safety of the dark.
Usual routine.
Right, but this time, he makes a radical, deliberate choice. He just brushes them aside. He literally reasons to himself, and I love this quote, "Self-defeating wounds won't work on me today."
Won't work on me today. I mean, I love the visual that immediately follows that declaration, too, because he doesn't just sit on the edge of his bed, meditating on his new enlightenment.
No, not at all.
He cheerfully hops onto his old, rusty bike with this totally renewed energy, like whistling as he pedals to campus to face a packed auditorium of students.
Yeah, it's a brilliant contrast to his usual state.
It really is a massive triumph.
Yeah.
But I think it raises a critical question. You don't just flip a switch after years of paralyzing grief. So, how did he manage this sudden shift?
Well, the answer lies in the lesson he brings to his students that very day. He reaches back into a memory of his own past to share a poem that, frankly, it fundamentally deconstructs the psychology of being stuck.
Right.
It is a really clinical look at the anatomy of regret, and it's titled, "There's a Life to be Lived Out There."
And the rhetoric of that poem is just relentless. Like, the entire structure is built on these probing questions that all start with, is there?
Yes, the repetition is key there.
Yeah, it asks things like, is there anything that we seek but never reach? Or, is there a moment that we want back? It really forces the listener to confront the could-haves and the should-haves, the unsaid words, the lingering grudges.
Exactly.
It even explicitly warns of a past that eventually will catch up.
The author is totally weaponizing the reader's own regret here. And during the lecture, there's a philosophy student named Mia who, well, she correctly identifies that this repetitive structure isn't just a clever poetic device.
Right, it's doing something much deeper.
Yeah, it directly mirrors the repetitive, cyclical nature of grief and reflection. Because neurologically speaking, when the brain experiences profound loss, it often creates a trauma loop.
A trauma loop.
Yeah, it just replays the same questions, the same missed opportunities, like it's trying to find a different outcome where none exists. So the poem's repetitive is there structure mimics that exact cognitive loop.
But wait, I have to ask, if you are trying to heal and move forward, isn't focusing on all these should-haves just a recipe for ruminating?
That's a really common concern, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like you are just forcing someone to stare directly into their own emotional wreckage. How does simulating a trauma loop actually help break it?
Because you cannot bypass the wreckage to get to the recovery. In psychological terms, what the poem is doing is basically exposure therapy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, by articulating those fears and regrets so relentlessly, it builds an immense amount of tension. It simulates that feeling of being trapped so that, well, when the pivot finally happens, it doesn't just read like a polite suggestion to be optimistic.
It feels like a release.
Exactly. It feels like an emotional jailbreak.
So you have to feel the absolute suffocation of the past before you are actually willing to drop it.
And that is exactly when the poem shifts. It moves from all this cyclical questioning to a sudden, resounding yes.
Yes.
It pivots from asking about missed opportunities to asking, is there a future not to be postponed? And then it declares that there is a world ready to be lived without ifs or buts.
Without ifs or buts. I love that phrasing. That is a definitive call to action. It is practically a command to snap out of the loop.
It really is. And it's the exact moment the professor himself experienced that morning. It's the realization that being in love with someone who is no longer there or, carrying the weight of a profound loss,
Yeah.
it does not permanently disqualify you from the present tense.
Right.
You have to stop postponing the future.
Okay, so deciding to act is one thing, but how does a brain relearn to actually engage with a world it has aggressively shut out for years?
That's the hard part, yeah.
Right, like you can decide to step out of the walled garden, but if you don't know how to participate in life anymore, you are just standing outside the wall, still paralyzed.
Yeah, just exposed.
Exactly. And that friction between intention and action is exactly what Cromwell-Smith addresses in the second poem he shares with the class.
Right, the second poem, Life's True Success is to Be Happy, which has this great subtitle, Life is Not a Spectator Sport. It's this deep dive into the very nature of human existence. It unpacks the crucial and honestly often uncomfortable distinction between being a spectator and being a participant in your own life.
And the critique of the spectator in this text is incredibly sharp. Like the poem points out that life offers this never-ending carousel of entertainment.
The carousel, right?
You can comfortably sit on the sidelines, watch the show go by, and even rejoice in the victories of others. But once the show ends, the thrill escapes in an absolute hurry.
Because vicarious living does not generate personal meaning. I mean, the text features this highly evocative detail about the emptiness of a meaningless life sinking in when you are alone at night with your own pillow.
Oh, that line hits hard.
It does. That is the ultimate litmus test for a life well lived. When all the distractions are stripped away, the spectator is still just left with themselves, and fundamentally nothing in their internal landscape has changed.
That imagery feels highly relevant to the modern listener, honestly. Like, it is the exact psychological experience of doom scrolling through other people's highlight reels on social media.
Oh, there's a perfect analogy.
Right. You feel like you are experiencing life because your brain is consuming all these high-definition images and intense emotions, but you're actually just watching from the bleachers. Your own life hasn't moved a single inch.
Exactly. Because when you are doom scrolling, you are just consuming the byproduct of someone else's participation.
Yeah.
You are metabolizing their experiences instead of generating your own. And the author's core argument is that true success is completely decoupled from material achievement, external validation, or, how well you spectate.
It's something else entirely.
Success is defined entirely as active involvement in a wholesome life experience.
To be the main participant, to actually get in the arena and risk the fall. And during the class discussion on this, there is a great moment where a student, Caleb, makes a really sharp observation.
Yeah, Caleb's point is crucial.
He points out that the poem suggests happiness is not something to be pursued directly. Instead, happiness ensues as a natural byproduct of this deliberate involvement.
Yes, it is the concept of indirect pursuit. Like if you wake up and say, I am going to hunt down happiness today, you will almost certainly fail.
Because you can't just catch it.
Right, because happiness isn't an object you can capture. It is a state that emerges from engagement. And by the way, that engagement isn't always pleasant either.
Not at all.
Active participation includes stumbling, losing, getting your heart broken, and just enduring.
It's like if life is a wheel on a road, happiness isn't the destination you drive to. Happiness is the heat generated by the rubber meeting the road.
Oh, I like that.
You only get it through the friction of participating. You can't generate heat while the car is parked in the garage, no matter how much you theorize about driving.
That heat, that friction, is the only thing that generates genuine meaning. And meaning is what actually insulates you when you are alone at night with your own pillow.
But this brings up a massive, heavy reality that we really have to address here. Because it is very easy for us to sit in a studio and say, just get out there and generate friction, or stop doom scrolling, get off the bleachers.
Very easy to say yes.
But what if you are actively carrying the weight of a profound, irreplaceable loss, like the professor himself did? If you are listening right now and feeling completely crushed by grief, we have profound empathy for that.
Absolutely.
And what is so compelling about this source material is that the text doesn't shy away from this problem at all. There's this great moment in the lecture where a student actually pushes back Cynthia, asking the exact question we are hovering over.
Cynthia's question is the turning point of the whole lecture.
She basically asks, how do you actually cultivate an awareness of life's simple joys when you are in the midst of paralyzing sorrow?
Right. Cynthia introduces the practical, philosophical challenge that tests the entire premise of the professor's lesson. She really represents the reality of the walled garden.
Yeah.
And the professor's response is honestly a masterclass in psychological insight. He starts by explaining the mechanics of what grief actually does to us. He notes that grief physically and emotionally narrows our focus. It creates this severe tunnel vision.
But why does it do that? Like, why does emotional pain physically limit what we can perceive?
Well, it is fundamentally an evolutionary survival mechanism.
Okay.
When the brain experiences severe trauma, the amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, it goes into complete overdrive. It treats emotional devastation the exact same way it treats a physical predator.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so it forces you to hyper-focus on the immediate source of pain just to survive it. Everything peripheral, the beauty of a sunset, a joke, a kind gesture, it's all filtered out as non-essential information.
That makes so much sense.
The brain essentially says, we don't have the caloric energy to appreciate a flower right now. We are bleeding.
Wow.
This is why the walled garden feels so inescapable. It is a biological imperative to keep the walls up.
So, when your vision is narrowed that tightly by a biological survival mechanism, how do you force it back open? Because you can't just yell at your amygdala to calm down.
You cannot. Which is why the professor explains that we must intentionally and systematically retrain our minds.
Retrain them.
Yes. We have to actively pry that narrowed focus back open by looking for granular details. We have to train ourselves to recognize beauty in the smallest, most non-threatening things.
Like what?
A smile, a kind word, a quiet moment of reflection. You essentially have to convince your nervous system that the environment is safe enough to process beauty again.
So it's like rebuilding the world one tiny piece of sensory data at a time.
Exactly.
And this is where the professor introduces his primary tool for this retraining, which is poetry. He explicitly cites poetry as the ultimate mechanism to break that tunnel vision. But why poetry specifically? Why not prose or painting or music?
It's a great question. Because poetry uses meter, rhythm, and condensed language to force cognitive deceleration.
Cognitive deceleration, slowing down.
Right. You cannot skim a poem the way you skim a news feed or a novel. The line breaks and the stanza structures demand that your brain slow down and look closely at the details.
Yeah, that's true.
It intentionally disrupts the rapid looping thoughts of a trauma response. By forcing you to focus on a hyper-specific image or metaphor, poetry interrupts the amygdala's panic loop and gently guides your attention back to the present moment, basically embedding you back within a shared human experience.
It is a structured, rhythmic way of practicing awareness. It forces the reader into the posture of a participant, even if only for the 3 minutes it takes to read the text.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the closing thoughts the professor shares with his class, because he uses this incredibly beautiful metaphor, telling his students that poetry serves as an inspirational telescope.
A telescope, yeah.
Oh.
And a telescope does two things simultaneously.
Okay.
First, it takes something that is overwhelmingly vast and distant like a galaxy and brings it close enough for the human eye to actually comprehend.
Right.
But secondly, it required you to close one eye and focus entirely on a single lens, blocking out all the immediate distractions around you just to see that bigger picture.
It allows the students and you, the listener, to gaze out at the vast, magnificent universe of life, even during those moments when grief makes your own personal world feel incredibly small and claustrophobic.
Yeah.
When you feel like you are trapped behind those high walls, that telescope gives you a view of the stars. It proves that there is a reality beyond your immediate pain.
It acts as an undeniable reminder that the universe is still expanding, the carousel is still turning, and that you are still a vital part of it, just waiting to participate again.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. I mean, we looked at how repetitive thoughts mirror the cognitive loops of grief, the critical difference between living vicariously as a spectator versus enduring the friction of a participant,
So much good stuff.
and the neurological reality of how trauma narrows our focus, plus how tools like poetry force the cognitive deceleration necessary to retrain the mind to see beauty again.
And honestly, it all stems from that single microscopic choice the professor made when he woke up. The decision that self-defeating wounds would not dictate his reality for one more day.
So, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to explore on your own today. We talked extensively about the telescope and how it helps you see beyond the walls of your grief, but consider what happens next.
Right, the next step.
What happens when you finally lower the telescope, step out of the bleachers, and actually tear down the walls of that garden?
Well, the walls don't just disappear, they crumble.
All right. And what are you left with? You are left with ruins. But here's the provocative reality. The soil beneath a torn down walled garden is incredibly fertile.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to look at it.
The years of sorrow, the intense emotional weight you carried, the deep introspection that doesn't just vanish, it decomposes and actually enriches the ground of your own psychology.
Yeah, it becomes fertilizer.
Exactly. People who have endured profound grief and actively chosen to participate in life again often find that their capacity for joy, their empathy for others, and their appreciation for the microscopic beauties of the world are vastly deeper than someone who has never built a wall in the first place.
Because the rubble of your past becomes the foundation for a much more resilient participation in the future.
So if you are currently feeling stuck in the bleachers, if your shadow self is whispering that it is safer to stay frozen, look through whatever your telescope is today. Find one tiny granular point of beauty or gratitude.
Just one thing.
Use it to interrupt the loop. And when you are ready to tear down the wall, remember that the ground you are standing on is richer than you could possibly imagine. It is ready for whatever you choose to plant next. Find your telescope and get back in the arena.